The October wind howled through the skeletal branches of the Massachusetts countryside as Jonathan Pell's carriage lurched along the muddy road toward the Wexley estate. The year 1874 had brought an unusually harsh autumn to Berkshire County, and the young Boston lawyer pulled his wool coat tighter as he peered through the rain-streaked window at the imposing silhouette emerging from the mist. Wexley Manor rose from the hillside like a Gothic cathedral, its dark stone towers piercing the grey sky. Gas lamps flickered in scattered windows, casting an amber glow that seemed to pulse with each gust of wind. Jonathan had heard whispers about this place in the gentlemen's clubs of Boston, stories of unprecedented wealth built on steel and railroad investments, of lavish parties that drew senators and foreign dignitaries, and of a family so reclusive that even their business partners had never seen the interior of their home. "Strange place for a fortune to be made," muttered Thomas, the elderly carriage driver, as they approached the wrought iron gates. "Been coming through these parts for 30 years, and I've never seen anyone leave this estate after dark." Jonathan adjusted his leather satchel containing the legal documents that had brought him here. The death of Cornelius Wexley, the family patriarch, had created a complex succession issue that required immediate attention. The telegram from Mrs. Eleanor Wexley had been brief but urgent. "Come at once. Family matters require discretion. Generous compensation assured." The gates opened with a prolonged creak, though Jonathan saw no gatekeeper. As they rolled up the circular drive, he noticed the meticulous landscaping. Perfectly trimmed hedges formed intricate patterns, and marble statues of classical figures stood sentinel along the path. Yet something felt wrong. The statues' faces seemed too lifelike, their expressions frozen in what looked like silent screams. The carriage stopped before the main entrance, where massive oak doors were flanked by towering columns. Before Jonathan could knock, the doors swung open to reveal a tall, gaunt man in impeccable evening wear. "Mr. Pell, I presume," the man said in a voice that seemed to echo from deep within his chest. "I am Silas, the family's steward. Mrs. Wexley is expecting you." Jonathan followed Silas through a grand foyer adorned with oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors. The air was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco, and something else, something sweet and cloying, that made his stomach turn slightly. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows on the walls, and Jonathan noticed that many of the portraits seemed to follow his movement with their painted eyes. "The family has been most anxious for your arrival," Silas continued, as they walked down a corridor lined with Persian rugs. "The matter of succession is delicate. There are traditions that must be observed." They entered a sitting room where a fire crackled in an ornate fireplace. Eleanor Wexley rose from a velvet armchair, and Jonathan was struck by her beauty despite her mourning attire. She appeared to be in her 40s, with raven black hair and pale skin that seemed almost translucent in the firelight. Her dark eyes held an intensity that made Jonathan feel as though she could see into his very soul. "Mr. Pell," she said, extending a gloved hand. "Thank you for making the journey in such dreadful weather. I trust Thomas treated you well during the ride?" "Indeed, Mrs. Wexley. Please accept my condolences for your loss. I understand Mr. Wexley's passing was quite sudden." Eleanor's smile faltered for just a moment. "Cornelius lived a full life, Mr. Pell, 83 years of prosperity. But his death has created certain complications that require immediate attention." She gestured for him to sit in the chair opposite hers. Silas appeared with a silver tray bearing brandy and disappeared as silently as he had arrived. "The Wexley fortune is substantial," Eleanor continued, "but it comes with obligations. Cornelius was very specific about how the succession should be handled. There are family traditions that must be honored, contracts that must be renewed." Jonathan opened his satchel and withdrew the documents. "I've reviewed the will and the trust documents you sent to my firm. The language regarding the succession is quite unusual. There are references to ancestral agreements and perpetual obligations that aren't clearly defined in legal terms. Eleanor's eyes gleamed in the firelight. The Wexley family has maintained its wealth for over a century through very specific arrangements. These arrangements require the participation of each new head of household. My late husband's nephew, Marcus, is the rightful heir, but he must first understand and accept his responsibilities. And where is Mr. Marcus Wexley? I was told he would be present for these proceedings. Marcus is preparing himself. He will join us for dinner tomorrow evening. Until then, you are our honored guest. Silas will show you to your room, and we shall discuss the details of the succession over breakfast. As if summoned by her words, Silas appeared in the doorway. Your room is ready, Mr. Pell. Dinner will be served at 8 o'clock sharp. The family dresses formally for evening meals. Jonathan followed the steward up a grand staircase, past more portraits of Wexley ancestors. He noticed that the paintings seemed to be arranged chronologically, with the oldest at the bottom of the stairs and the most recent near the top. What struck him as odd was that many of the subjects appeared to be seated at dining tables, and their expressions grew increasingly somber as the paintings became more recent. His room was luxuriously appointed with mahogany furniture and silk wallpaper. A fire had already been lit, and his luggage had been unpacked. As Silas prepared to leave, Jonathan stopped him. Silas, I couldn't help but notice the portraits in the hallway. The family seems to have a tradition of formal dining paintings. The steward's face remained impassive. The Wexley family places great importance on gathering together. Even in death, family bonds remain strong. In death, a figure of speech, Mr. Pell. The family believes that those who have passed continue to watch over the living. Now, if you'll excuse me, I must prepare for this evening's meal. Alone in his room, Jonathan walked to the window and gazed out at the estate grounds. Through the rain, he could see outbuildings and what appeared to be a small cemetery surrounded by iron fencing. Lightning illuminated the scene for a brief moment, and he could swear he saw a figure moving among the headstones. As he unpacked his formal dinner attire, Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that he had stepped into something far more complex than a simple inheritance dispute. The Wexley family's wealth was legendary, but the circumstances surrounding it seemed shrouded in mystery and tradition that bordered on the macabre. The sound of a dinner bell echoing through the mansion interrupted his thoughts. As he dressed for the evening meal, Jonathan wondered what other surprises the Wexley family had in store for him. Outside, the wind continued to howl, and somewhere in the distance, he could hear what sounded like voices, though whether they belonged to the living or the dead, he could not say. The dining room of Wexley Manor was a testament to old-world opulence. A massive mahogany table stretched nearly the length of the room, set with gleaming silver and delicate china that caught the light from an enormous crystal chandelier. Tall windows draped in burgundy velvet looked out onto the storm-lashed grounds, and oil paintings of long-dead Wexleys gazed down from the walls with expressions that seemed to shift in the flickering candlelight. Jonathan entered the room in his formal evening wear to find Eleanor Wexley already seated at the head of the table. She had changed into an elegant black gown that seemed to absorb the light around her, making her pale skin appear almost luminous. To her right sat a young man Jonathan assumed must be Marcus Wexley, the heir apparent. Marcus appeared to be in his late 20s, with the sharp features and dark hair characteristic of the Wexley bloodline. However, his eyes held a haunted quality that seemed far older than his years. He stood as Jonathan approached, extending a trembling hand. "Mr. Pell," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I apologize for not greeting you upon your arrival. I've been indisposed. Quite understandable given the circumstances, Jonathan replied, noting the young man's pallor and the dark circles under his eyes. Please accept my condolences for your uncle's passing. Marcus flinched at the mention of Cornelius's death, and Eleanor quickly intervened. Please, gentlemen, let us not dwell on sorrowful matters during our meal. Mr. Pell, you must try our chef's preparation of venison. The meat comes from deer that roam our own grounds. Silas appeared with the first course, moving with the silent efficiency Jonathan had observed earlier. The soup was rich and flavorful, but Jonathan noticed that Marcus barely touched his bowl, instead staring fixedly at the empty chairs that lined the opposite side of the table. I must say, Jonathan began, attempting to break the uncomfortable silence, your home is quite remarkable. The architecture suggests it was built in the early part of the century. 1798, Eleanor replied. Built by the first Cornelius Wexley, with profits from his shipping ventures. Each generation has added to both the structure and the family fortune. We've been blessed with remarkable prosperity and cursed with remarkable obligations, Marcus muttered, earning a sharp look from Eleanor. Marcus speaks of the responsibilities that come with wealth, Eleanor explained smoothly. The Wexley family has always understood that great fortune requires great sacrifice. And as the meal progressed through multiple courses, Jonathan became increasingly aware of the strange atmosphere that permeated the dining room. The servants moved like shadows, appearing and disappearing without sound. The candles seemed to burn with an unusual intensity, casting dancing shadows that created the illusion of movement in the empty chairs across the table. Mrs. Wexley, Jonathan said during the main course, I've been reviewing the family documents, and I must confess that some of the language is quite archaic. There are references to eternal contracts and blood obligations that seem more suited to medieval times than modern business arrangements. Eleanor set down her wineglass and regarded him with those penetrating dark eyes. The Wexley family has maintained certain traditions that have served us well for generations. Our prosperity is not merely the result of shrewd investments, Mr. Pell. It is the product of agreements made long ago, agreements that must be honored by each successive generation. What sort of agreements? Jonathan pressed. Marcus suddenly stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. I can't do this, he said, his voice rising. I won't be part of this madness. Uncle Cornelius is dead, and I refuse to... Marcus! Eleanor's voice cut through the air like a whip. Remember your place. Remember what you owe to this family. The young man's face went white, and he slowly sank back into his chair. Forgive me, he whispered. The grief. It makes me speak foolishly. Jonathan watched this exchange with growing unease. There were undercurrents here that went far beyond normal family dynamics. The way Eleanor commanded Marcus, the young man's obvious terror, the strange references to obligations and contracts, it all suggested something far more sinister than a simple inheritance dispute. Perhaps, Eleanor said, her voice returning to its earlier warmth, it would be beneficial for Mr. Pell to understand the full scope of our family's history. Marcus, why don't you show our guest the portrait gallery after dinner? The paintings tell quite a story. Marcus nodded reluctantly, and the remainder of the meal passed in relative silence. Jonathan found himself studying the empty chairs across the table, wondering why such a large dining room was set for only 3 people. The shadows cast by the candles seemed to create the impression of figures seated in those chairs, silent, watching presences that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. After the final course, Eleanor excused herself, claiming fatigue from the day's events. Marcus led Jonathan through a series of corridors to a long gallery lined with portraits. Unlike the paintings Jonathan had seen earlier, these were all formal dining scenes, each depicting members of the Wexley family seated at what appeared to be the same table they had just left. These paintings document every head of the Wexley household for the past 75 years, Marcus explained, his voice hollow. Each one painted during their inauguration dinner. Jonathan studied the portraits more closely. The earliest paintings showed subjects who appeared healthy and prosperous, but as the chronology progressed, the faces became increasingly gaunt and haunted. The most recent painting showed Cornelius Wexley seated at the head of the table, but he was not alone. Shadowy figures occupied the other chairs, their faces indistinct but somehow menacing. "Marcus," Jonathan said carefully, "what exactly happened to your uncle? The telegram mentioned sudden death, but no details were provided." Marcus stopped before the portrait of Cornelius and stared at it with a mixture of fear and revulsion. "He died at the dinner table, Mr. Pell. During the monthly gathering, he simply stopped breathing, as if something had drawn the life from his body." Monthly gathering? The family tradition. Every month on the night of the new moon, the head of the household must dine with the previous generations. It's part of the contract, part of what maintains our wealth. Jonathan felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean, dine with previous generations?" Marcus turned to face him, and in the dim light of the gallery, his face looked like that of a man condemned to death. "The dead, Mr. Pell. The Wexley family dines with the dead. And now that Uncle Cornelius is gone, it falls to me to take his place at the table." Thunder crashed outside, and the lights in the gallery flickered. In that moment of darkness, Jonathan could have sworn he saw movement in the portraits, as if the painted figures were turning to look at him with hollow, hungry eyes. "I need some air," Jonathan said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. As he hurried back toward his room, Marcus's voice followed him down the corridor. "You can't leave, Mr. Pell. None of us can leave. The contract won't allow it." Jonathan reached his room and locked the door behind him, his heart pounding. Through his window, he could see the cemetery in the distance, and this time he was certain he saw figures moving among the headstones. Tall, pale forms that seemed to glide rather than walk. Whatever he had stumbled into at Wexley Manor, it was far more than a legal matter. As he sat by the fire, trying to make sense of what he had learned, one thought kept returning to haunt him. If the Wexley family truly dined with the dead, what did that make him? A living man trapped in a house of shadows and secrets. Jonathan spent a restless night, plagued by dreams of empty chairs and watching eyes. When dawn finally broke through the storm clouds, he found himself staring out his window at the Wexley cemetery, where morning mist clung to the weathered headstones like ghostly shrouds. The events of the previous evening felt surreal in the pale daylight, yet the fear that had gripped him remained as real as the cold Massachusetts air seeping through the window frame. A soft knock at his door interrupted his brooding. Silas entered with a breakfast tray, his gaunt face expressionless as always. "Mrs. Wexley requests your presence in the library at your earliest convenience," the steward announced. "She wishes to discuss the legal documents before this evening's proceedings." "What proceedings?" Jonathan asked, though he dreaded the answer. "The monthly gathering, sir. It cannot be postponed, regardless of recent events. The contract must be honored." Oh, after Silas departed, Jonathan dressed quickly and made his way to the library, a vast room lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes. Eleanor sat behind an ornate desk, dressed in deep purple that made her pale skin appear almost translucent. Before her lay a collection of yellow documents and what appeared to be an ancient ledger. "Good morning, Mr. Pell. I trust you slept well?" "As well as could be expected," Jonathan replied, taking the seat across from her. "Mrs. Wexley, I must be frank. The conversation last evening has left me deeply concerned about the nature of this inheritance. Marcus spoke of dining with the dead, of contracts that bind the living. Surely these are metaphorical references to family traditions." Eleanor's smile was cold and knowing. "I'm afraid not, Mr. Pell. The Wexley fortune is built upon a very literal agreement with forces that most would consider supernatural. But before you dismiss this as the ravings of a grief-stricken family, allow me to show you something. She opened the ancient ledger and turned it toward him. The pages were filled with entries dating back to 1798, each one documenting financial transactions of staggering amounts. But what caught Jonathan's attention were the signatures at the bottom of each page. Signatures that appeared to be written in what looked suspiciously like dried blood. The first Cornelius Wexley was a desperate man, Eleanor began, her voice taking on the cadence of a well-rehearsed story. His shipping business was failing, his creditors were closing in, and his family faced ruin. In his desperation, he sought out alternative means of securing his fortune. She turned several pages, revealing a document written in archaic script. This is the original contract, signed in the basement of this very house. Cornelius agreed to provide monthly sustenance to the spirits of those who had died in service to wealth, murdered business partners, exploited workers, anyone whose death had contributed to someone else's prosperity. In exchange, his family would enjoy unprecedented financial success. Jonathan studied the document, his legal training warring with his growing horror. This is madness. You're asking me to believe that your family's wealth comes from some sort of supernatural pact? I'm asking you to believe the evidence of your own eyes, Eleanor replied. She stood and walked to a section of the library wall, pressing a hidden mechanism that caused a panel to swing open, revealing a narrow stone staircase descending into darkness. Come, Mr. Pell. Let me show you where the monthly gatherings take place. Against his better judgment, Jonathan followed her down the stairs. The air grew colder with each step, and the scent he had noticed upon his arrival, that sweet, cloying smell, grew stronger. Gas lamps flickered to life as they descended, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. The staircase ended in a vast underground chamber that took Jonathan's breath away. The room was an exact replica of the dining room above, complete with the same mahogany table and crystal chandelier. But this table was occupied. Seated around the table were dozens of figures in various states of decay. Some appeared to be recent additions, their flesh still clinging to their bones, while others were little more than skeletons dressed in rotting finery. At the head of the table sat a figure that Jonathan recognized from the portraits above, the first Cornelius Wexley, his mummified face frozen in a rictus grin. "Dear God," Jonathan whispered, his legs threatening to give way beneath him. "God has nothing to do with this place," Eleanor said matter-of-factly. "This is where the true business of the Wexley family is conducted. Every month, the head of the household must come here and share a meal with our partners. They feed on the life force of the living, and in return, they ensure our continued prosperity." Jonathan noticed that several of the corpses wore the clothing of different eras, some in colonial dress, others in more recent fashions. Who are they? Previous heads of the Wexley household, and others who have contributed to our success over the years. Business partners who outlived their usefulness, competitors who stood in our way, family members who tried to break the contract. Eleanor's voice remained calm, as if she were discussing the weather. They all serve the family now, in death as they did in life. This is impossible. The dead cannot... His words were cut off as one of the corpses at the table slowly turned its head toward him. Empty eye sockets seemed to bore into his soul, and the thing's jaw moved as if trying to speak. Other figures around the table began to stir, their desiccated forms creaking like old leather. "They know you're here," Eleanor observed. "They can sense living flesh. It's been 3 days since Uncle Cornelius's death, and they grow hungry." Jonathan backed toward the stairs, but Eleanor blocked his path. "I'm afraid I can't allow you to leave just yet, Mr. Pell. You see, there's something I haven't told you about your presence here." "What do you mean?" "Your firm wasn't chosen at random to handle this succession. We researched your background quite thoroughly. Tell me, what do you know about your maternal grandfather?" Jonathan's blood ran cold. He died when I was young. My mother rarely spoke of him. His name was Ezra Blackwood, and he was a business partner of the second Cornelius Wexley, a very successful partnership until Mr. Blackwood developed moral objections to certain family practices. He tried to expose the truth about our wealth, threatened to bring authorities to investigate the estate. Eleanor gestured toward one of the more recent corpses at the table, and Jonathan saw with horror that it wore the same style of clothing his grandfather had favored in the few photographs he had seen. Grandfather Ezra has been dining with the family for 30 years now, and according to the terms of the original contract, his bloodline owes a debt to the Wexley family, a debt that can only be paid by joining our eternal gathering. The corpses around the table were becoming more animated, their movements growing stronger as they sensed the presence of fresh blood. Jonathan realized, with dawning horror, that he had not been brought here as a lawyer, but as a sacrifice. Marcus was never the intended heir, Eleanor continued. He's too weak, too frightened to properly serve the family's needs. But you, Mr. Pell, have the strength and intelligence we require. And more importantly, you have the bloodline debt that makes your participation mandatory. Jonathan lunged for the stairs, but Eleanor was faster than her appearance suggested. She grabbed his arm with surprising strength, and he felt a sharp pain as something pierced his skin. Looking down, he saw that she wore a ring with a needle-like projection that had injected some kind of substance into his bloodstream. A mild paralytic, she explained as Jonathan's legs began to weaken. It will wear off in time for tonight's dinner. You'll want to be conscious for the ceremony. It's quite an honor to join such distinguished company. As the drug took effect, Jonathan's vision began to blur. The last thing he saw before losing consciousness was the corpse of his grandfather turning its eyeless skull toward him, its jaw moving in what might have been a welcoming smile. When darkness claimed him, Jonathan could hear Eleanor's voice echoing in the chamber. "Welcome to the family, Mr. Pell. Welcome to your new eternal home." Jonathan awoke to the sound of rain against stone walls and the acrid smell of burning candles. His head throbbed, and his limbs felt heavy as lead. As consciousness slowly returned, he found himself in what appeared to be a small stone cell beneath the manor. Iron bars separated him from a narrow corridor lit by flickering torches, and through the shadows he could make out other cells lining the underground passage. "You're awake," came a weak voice from the cell across from his. Jonathan squinted through the gloom and saw Marcus Wexley huddled in the corner, his once fine clothes now torn and dirty. "I was beginning to think Eleanor had given you too much of the paralytic." "Marcus, what are you doing down here?" The young man laughed bitterly. "The same thing you are, waiting to fulfill my family obligations. Eleanor decided that my reluctance to embrace my inheritance made me unsuitable as the new head of household. Apparently, she's found a more willing candidate." Jonathan struggled to his feet, testing the strength of the iron bars. They were solid and old, but well maintained. "How long have I been unconscious?" "Most of the day. The sun set an hour ago, which means the gathering will begin soon. Eleanor likes to start precisely at midnight. Something about the veil between worlds being thinnest then." "This is madness, Marcus. Surely there must be a way to break this contract, to end this nightmare." Marcus shook his head. "I've spent years researching our family history, looking for any loophole or escape clause. The original contract was written in blood and sealed with death. It can only be broken by the complete destruction of the Wexley bloodline, or by finding someone willing to take our place permanently." "What do you mean, take your place?" "The contract requires a living head of household to maintain the connection between the dead and the world of the living. If that person dies or is replaced, the agreement continues with the new individual. It's how the family has survived for so long. When one generation grows too old or too weak, they simply find a suitable replacement." Jonathan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold stone walls. "And Eleanor believes I'm that replacement. Your grandfather's debt makes you legally bound to the family, according to the terms of the original agreement. But there's more to it than that." Marcus moved closer to the bars, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I've been listening to Eleanor and Silas planning. They intend to use you not just as the new head of household, but as a permanent bridge between the living and the dead. A living sacrifice that will strengthen the contract and ensure the family's prosperity for another century." The sound of footsteps echoed through the corridor, and Silas appeared carrying a bundle of formal evening wear. "Mr. Pell, Mrs. Wexley requests that you prepare yourself for tonight's ceremony. You'll want to look your best for such an auspicious occasion." "I won't participate in this madness," Jonathan said, though his voice lacked conviction. Silas smiled, an expression that looked unnatural on his gaunt features. "I'm afraid you have little choice in the matter. The paralytic has been replaced with something far more persuasive. You'll find that your body will obey the family's wishes, regardless of your mental objections." As if to prove his point, Jonathan felt his hands moving against his will, reaching for the formal clothes through the bars. The drug Eleanor had injected him with had evolved into something that controlled his physical actions while leaving his mind terrifyingly aware. "Don't fight it," Marcus advised sadly. "It only makes the experience more painful. I learned that lesson years ago." Silas unlocked the cell door and stood back as Jonathan's body mechanically dressed itself in the evening wear. The clothes fit perfectly, as if they had been tailored specifically for him. As he dressed, Silas provided a running commentary. "The ceremony tonight will be particularly special. Not only will we be welcoming a new head of household, but we'll also be strengthening the original contract with fresh blood. The dead grow stronger with each feeding, and their power to influence the world of the living increases accordingly." "How many people have you murdered for this insane ritual?" Jonathan managed to ask, though his voice sounded strange and distant. "Murder is such an ugly word," Silas replied. "We prefer to think of it as recruitment. Every person who joins our eternal gathering does so to serve a greater purpose. The Wexley family's wealth has built hospitals, funded schools, supported countless charitable endeavors. A few individual sacrifices for the greater good seems quite reasonable." When Jonathan was fully dressed, Silas produced a set of ornate shackles that locked around his wrists and ankles. The chains were long enough to allow movement, but would prevent any attempt at escape. "These are a family heirloom," Silas explained, "worn by every head of household during their first gathering. They'll be removed once you've fully accepted your new role." As they prepared to leave the cell, Marcus called out desperately, "Jonathan, there is one thing. Something I discovered in my grandfather's papers. The contract has a weakness, but you have to be willing to—" Silas struck Marcus across the face with a metal rod, cutting off his words. "Enough. Mr. Wexley has said quite enough for one evening." They ascended through a different staircase than the one Jonathan had used earlier, emerging into a part of the manor he hadn't seen before. The walls here were covered with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the torchlight, ancient markings that hurt to look at directly. "The ceremonial wing," Silas explained, "built by the second generation specifically for our monthly gatherings. The symbols help maintain the connection between worlds and keep the dead manageable." They entered a preparation chamber where Eleanor waited, now dressed in an elaborate black gown that seemed to absorb light. Her pale skin had been painted with the same writhing symbols that covered the walls, and her dark eyes gleamed with an unholy excitement. "Mr. Pell, you look magnificent. The formal wear suits you perfectly. It should, considering it belonged to your grandfather during his final gathering." Jonathan's controlled body shuddered involuntarily. "You're all insane. This can't continue forever. Eventually, someone will discover what you're doing here." My dear man, we've been conducting these ceremonies for over 70 years without discovery. The local authorities are well compensated for their discretion, and our charitable contributions ensure that no one asks uncomfortable questions about the Wexley family's private affairs. Eleanor approached him with a silver chalice filled with a dark liquid that seemed to move of its own accord. This will complete your preparation, a mixture of herbs and other ingredients that will open your mind to the presence of the dead. I won't drink it. You will, she said confidently, and Jonathan felt his hands reaching for the chalice against his will. The liquid burned as it went down, tasting of copper and decay. Almost immediately, his vision began to change. The walls seemed to become transparent, revealing shadowy figures moving through the manor. The dead were everywhere, he realized, not just in the underground chamber, but throughout the entire estate. Now you can see them as they truly are, Eleanor said with satisfaction. The Wexley family's eternal servants, bound to this place by death and contract. They've been waiting so long for a new master, someone with the strength to command them properly. As the drug took full effect, Jonathan began to understand the true scope of the horror he had stumbled into. The Wexley estate wasn't just home to a family of murderers. It was a nexus between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, maintained by blood sacrifice and sustained by the life force of the unwilling. And now, whether he wanted it or not, he was about to become the keystone that held it all together. The sound of a bell tolling midnight echoed through the manor, and Eleanor smiled with anticipation. It's time, Mr. Pell. Time to take your place at the head of the table and claim your inheritance. As they walked toward the underground chamber, Jonathan caught glimpses of the ghostly figures that now filled his vision. They followed the procession with hungry eyes, their ethereal forms growing more solid with each step toward the ceremonial dining room. Whatever Marcus had been trying to tell him about the contract's weakness, Jonathan prayed he would remember it in time. Because once the ceremony began, he suspected there would be no turning back from the nightmare that awaited him in the depths of Wexley Manor. The underground dining chamber had been transformed for the ceremony. Hundreds of candles cast dancing shadows on the stone walls, and the air thrummed with an energy that made Jonathan's skin crawl. The corpses around the table were more animated than before, their movements becoming increasingly fluid as midnight approached. At the head of the table, the chair that had belonged to Cornelius Wexley sat empty, waiting for its new occupant. Eleanor led the procession into the chamber, followed by Silas and several other servants Jonathan hadn't seen before. Pale, gaunt figures who moved with the same unnatural grace as the steward. Behind them came Jonathan, his body still under the control of Eleanor's drug, though his mind remained horrifyingly aware of everything happening around him. "Behold," Eleanor announced to the assembled dead, "the new master of the Wexley estate. Jonathan Pell, grandson of Ezra Blackwood, has come to fulfill his family's debt and assume his rightful place among us." The corpses around the table turned their attention to Jonathan, and he could feel their hunger like a physical weight pressing against his chest. Some of the more recent additions to the gathering still retained enough flesh to smile, while the older ones simply stared with empty sockets that somehow conveyed their anticipation. "The ceremony must follow the traditional forms," Eleanor continued, producing an ornate dagger from beneath her gown. "First, the new head of household must offer his blood to renew the contract. Then, he must partake of the communion meal that binds him to his eternal family." Jonathan's body moved forward against his will, approaching the head of the table, where a silver bowl waited beside the empty chair. The drug that controlled his movements was stronger now, but his mind raced desperately, trying to remember what Marcus had been attempting to tell him about the contract's weakness. "Your grandfather sat in this very chair during his final gathering," Eleanor said, her voice taking on a ritualistic cadence. "He fought against his fate, just as you are fighting now. But in the end, he understood that resistance was futile. The debt must be paid. The contract must be honored. As Jonathan's hand reached for the dagger, a commotion erupted from the stairway. Marcus Wexley stumbled into the chamber, his face bloodied, but his eyes blazing with determination. In his hands, he carried what appeared to be a bundle of old documents. "Stop!" Marcus shouted, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "I found it, the weakness in the contract. Jonathan, you have to listen to me." Eleanor whirled around, her face contorting with rage. "How did you escape your cell? Silas, deal with this interruption immediately." But Marcus had already reached the center of the chamber, holding the documents high above his head. "These are the original papers from my great-great-grandfather's correspondence. The contract can be broken, but only if the current head of household willingly sacrifices himself to destroy the connection between worlds." "Lies!" Eleanor hissed. "The contract is eternal, unbreakable." "No," Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger. "The first Cornelius built in a fail-safe, a way to end the agreement if it ever became too dangerous to continue. But it requires the willing death of someone with both Wexley and Blackwood blood." Jonathan felt a spark of hope pierce through the drug-induced haze controlling his body. His grandfather had been a Blackwood, and if Marcus was telling the truth about the Wexley bloodline, "You're both Wexley and Blackwood," Marcus said, as if reading his thoughts. "Your grandmother was a distant Wexley cousin. That's how your grandfather first became involved with the family business. The bloodlines converged in you, making you the perfect candidate not just to continue the contract, but to end it." Eleanor's composure finally cracked completely. "You foolish boy. Do you have any idea what you're suggesting? Without the contract, the Wexley fortune will crumble. Everything our family has built will be lost." "Better poverty than this abomination," Marcus replied. "Jonathan, the ritual requires you to willingly spill your blood on the original contract while speaking the words of dissolution. But you have to choose it freely. The drug can't force you to make that sacrifice." The corpses around the table were becoming agitated, sensing that their eternal feast might be threatened. Several of the more recent additions began to rise from their chairs, their movements becoming more coordinated and purposeful. The thing that had once been Ezra Blackwood turned its eyeless skull toward Jonathan, and for a moment he could swear he heard his grandfather's voice whispering in his mind, "End this, boy, end what I was too weak to stop." Eleanor raised the ceremonial dagger, her eyes wild with desperation. "If I can't have a willing successor, then I'll complete the ritual by force. The contract will be strengthened by unwilling blood, and the dead will have enough power to walk freely in the world of the living." She lunged toward Jonathan, but the drug's control over his body was beginning to weaken as his adrenaline surged. He managed to dodge her attack, grabbing the silver bowl from the table and smashing it against the stone floor. The sound echoed through the chamber like a gunshot, and several of the corpses flinched as if in pain. "The silver disrupts their connection to this world," Marcus shouted over the growing chaos. "Use anything metal you can find." Jonathan seized the ornate candelabra from the table and swung it at the nearest corpse, which dissolved into mist upon contact with the silver. But there were dozens of them, and they were growing stronger by the moment, feeding off the psychic energy generated by the ceremony. Eleanor had recovered from her mist attack and was chanting in a language that predated English, her voice growing louder and more frenzied with each word. The symbols on the walls began to glow with an unholy light, and the temperature in the chamber dropped noticeably. "The original contract," Marcus called out, pointing to a stone pedestal near the far wall where an ancient document lay beneath a glass case. "You have to reach it before she completes the summoning ritual." Jonathan fought his way through the crowd of animated corpses, using the silver candelabra to clear a path. Behind him, he could hear Eleanor's chanting reaching a crescendo, and the very air seemed to vibrate with malevolent energy. The dead were becoming more solid, more real, as the barrier between worlds weakened. He reached the pedestal and smashed the glass case with the candelabra, grabbing the yellowed parchment that contained the original contract. The document was written in faded ink that looked suspiciously like dried blood, and touching it sent a shock of cold energy up his arm. "Now," Marcus shouted, "you have to choose freely. Speak the words of dissolution while spilling your blood on the contract." Jonathan looked back at the chaos in the chamber. Eleanor's ritual was nearly complete, and the corpses were beginning to take on fully solid forms. If he failed now, they would be unleashed upon the world, and the Wexley family's evil would spread far beyond the confines of the estate. He pressed the sharp edge of the broken glass against his palm, feeling the warm blood begin to flow. As the red drops fell onto the ancient parchment, he spoke the words Marcus had found in the family documents. "By blood given freely, by choice made willingly, I dissolve the bonds that tie the living to the dead. Let the contract be broken, let the debt be paid, let the dead find their rest." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Eleanor's chanting cut off abruptly as she screamed in rage and terror. The glowing symbols on the walls began to fade, and the corpses around the table started to crumble into dust. The thing that had been Ezra Blackwood turned toward Jonathan one final time, and this time the voice in his mind was clear and grateful. "Thank you, grandson. Thank you for setting us free." The chamber began to shake as the supernatural forces that had held it together for over a century suddenly collapsed. Cracks appeared in the stone walls, and chunks of the ceiling began to fall. Eleanor made one last desperate lunge for the contract, but the document burst into flames as soon as she touched it, reducing itself to ash in seconds. "We have to get out of here." Marcus grabbed Jonathan's arm, pulling him toward the staircase as the underground chamber began to collapse around them. Behind them, Eleanor's screams were cut short as a massive stone fell from the ceiling, crushing her beneath its weight. They raced up the stairs as the manor shook and groaned above them. The supernatural energy that had maintained the estate for generations was dissipating, and without it, the old building was finally succumbing to the ravages of time. Windows shattered, walls cracked, and the very foundations seemed to be settling as they ran through the corridors toward the main entrance. Silas appeared in their path, his gaunt face twisted with fury. "You've destroyed everything," he snarled, raising a pistol toward Jonathan. 70 years of faithful service, and you've ruined it all." But before he could fire, a section of the ceiling collapsed, burying the steward beneath tons of debris. Jonathan and Marcus barely escaped the same fate, diving through the main doors just as the entire front facade of Wexley Manor began to crumble. They ran across the grounds as the estate collapsed behind them, the sound of destruction echoing across the Massachusetts countryside. When they finally stopped, gasping for breath near the cemetery gates, Jonathan turned to look back at what had been one of the most magnificent homes in New England. Wexley Manor was gone, reduced to a pile of rubble and dust. The supernatural forces that had maintained it were broken, and with them, the evil that had plagued the Wexley family for generations had finally come to an end. "It's over," Marcus said quietly, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. "The contract is broken, the dead are at rest, and the family curse is ended." Jonathan nodded, looking down at his bandaged hand where he had cut himself to complete the ritual. "What will you do now? Without the supernatural wealth, the family fortune will disappear." Marcus smiled for the first time since Jonathan had met him. "I'll find honest work, build a life based on my own efforts rather than blood money. It won't be easy, but it will be clean." As dawn broke over the ruins of the estate, Jonathan felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he was carrying. His grandfather's debt was finally paid, and the nightmare that had claimed so many lives was over. The Wexley family's macabre fortune had come to an end, and with it their tradition of dining with the dead. The living were free to live, and the dead were free to rest in peace at last. In the distance, Church bells began to toll, welcoming a new day, a day free from the shadows that had haunted Berkshire County for far too long. Jonathan Pell gathered his few belongings and began the long walk back to Boston, leaving behind the ruins of Wexley Manor and the dark secrets it had contained. The nightmare was over, and the dawn of a new chapter